the Great Leap Forward, what were the ideas, fears, and dreams that propelled Mao's radical project for modernization? After winning China's civil war, leaning towards Moscow in the Cold War, and negotiating a treaty with the Soviet Union for mutual assistance, Mao was finally in a position to consolidate his authority over the territory of China and to inaugurate a socialist revolution. It's important to keep in mind that the Communist Party in late 1949 and 1950, triumphant as it was, had prevailed over a very unpopular nationalist regime led by Chiang Kai-shek. In the process of defeating the nationalists, Mao had articulated a vision of rejuvenating China and restoring its sovereignty after a century of humiliation and colonial domination. One of his critical strategies was to articulate the idea of a big tent and to invite supporters of Chiang Kai-shek to switch sides. And this decisive changing of sides from the nationalists to the communists was critical in the victory of the Civil War. But it also meant that after victory in 1949, the majority of people in the socialist big tent were not actually socialists or Marxists. They were in many ways former supporters of Chiang Kai-shek, more conservative, and certainly not supporters of a very radical revolution. So the coalition that was in place wasn't necessarily united on a program for reform. So Mao's strategy he was definitely a very convinced Bolshevik, was on one hand to orchestrate a socialist revolution, to establish real socialism, not just the socialism that worked in Russia or what the Russians had applied, but a socialism that would fit the conditions in China. But in the process of orchestrating this socialist revolution, he was also conscious that many people that were supposedly in his camp were not necessarily supportive of these reforms. So his approach was also tactical as well as ideological. One of his first real reform programs in 1950 and 1951 was to target the landlords, the landowners who owned most of the soil in China, had long oppressed the peasants, or at the very least had controlled the wealth and left the peasants with very little. So the peasants were the most enthusiastic supporters of the Communist Party and Mao's leadership personally, and the landed elite had been the most vocal supporters of Chiang Kai-shek, who had beat a retreat to Taiwan. So the first real pillar of socialist reform was focusing on redistributing the land. And the way that Mao organized this land reform movement is he essentially whipped up the landless peasants into a mob that would visit their landlord's estate. They would haul the landlord, his sons, his family, shame them for abusing them in the past, beat them, humiliate them, and in the process, the party would redistribute the land in an equitable fashion to the peasants. Now, this was a very large process that unfolded over China in its various districts. The party played a big hand in whipping up the peasants to attack the landlord class. It was also in a context of the Korean War, in which Mao used the Korean War to whip up a sense of nationalism and a sense of being under attack from outside forces and the capitalist rear guard. Now, the second part of the reform was really focused on essentially establishing a socialist state, because there were many nationalist factory owners, that were in the capitalist camp. In many cases, private businesses were still in operation. Even large factory owners maintained control over their businesses. So the second element of the socialist revolution was where the party essentially began the process of trying to purge those more conservative elements and recent changes of uniforms among the nationalists, as well as to expropriate large businesses and begin the process of having them produce for the state. The third element or plank of Mao's socialist revolution was focused on industrializing the economy. In particular, the Soviet partnership and treaty was very significant. Thousands of Soviet experts came to China. Soviet industrial equipment was installed in cities to expand the industrial sectors of the economy: steel, coal production, electricity, basic manufacturing. Soviet loans, Soviet equipment, Soviet experts were really key in this from 1951 to 1956 to industrialize the Soviet state. So it was in this context in 1956 that Mao was, although he had largely succeeded in building a more egalitarian society in the countryside, privatize private businessmen, build an industrial base, he was dissatisfied in many ways in 1956. He felt that this reform movement had run out of steam, that a new direction was necessary. He resented the influence of the Soviet Union. He wanted to pay back the money that he owed to the Soviet Union, because he felt that he wasn't a full partner and he was under the tutelage and the control of the Soviet Union. So it was for all of these reasons that Mao was eager to go into a new direction. And the direction that he chose, this radical program, he called the Great Leap Forward. And what the Great Leap Forward essentially meant is that Mao was, in the next stage of industrialization, going to take control, and rather than following the Soviet playbook and investing in industrial equipment, he was instead going to apply this radical novel theory that he was going to catch up to the most industrialized countries in the world, Britain and the United States, in a single decade, by mobilizing the enthusiasm and the support of the Chinese peasants, which was the one resource that China had in abundance. So one of the interpretive challenges we have in understanding the Great Leap Forward is that it had these many interlocking dimensions. I've already, in the previous slide, narrated some of the history, the origins of the Great Leap Forward. Mao first used the concept in 1956 to essentially denote his strategy to usher in a new era of Chinese economic development. And the Great Leap Forward was associated particularly with the collectivization of agriculture. So what does collectivization mean? What it essentially means is that the Chinese peasants who had their own home, their own household goods, and their own land, thanks to the Communist Party land reforms of 1950 and 1951, now had to surrender their land, their livestock, many of their household goods to the party that had created a commune, a collective enterprise, and now these peasants, rather than being in charge of their own lives, were essentially workers for this cooperative. So most Chinese peasants were not enthusiastic for this at all. Even those that had very few goods, they were essentially losing control over the pace of their life and their resources. Now, it's also important to understand that this was not only an attempt to restructure the countryside in the unit of production, but it was also an attempt to restructure society itself in a very radical utopian socialist ways. Mao really blamed Chinese backwardness for China's traditional culture. The gender distinctions, the family household, the suspicions, the household religions. So what he was trying to do in this new cooperative society was essentially level the distinctions between genders. There would be a barracks for men and women. He was breaking up the household. And even children now would no longer belong to the family and their parents. They would belong to the community, and they would be raised in creches. So, rather than having your home and eating there together as a family, you now all eat in a canteen. I'm not going to go into, all the depths of this, radical utopian socialism, but it's important to denote that this was an important component of the Great Leap Forward. Another important element of this was essentially state control over the individual in a very pernicious, deep way. In particular, the party, through a cadre, a representative in the cooperative village, was now in charge of all decisions. He would decide, who would do what work, who would get what food, and if you displeased him and he didn't like you, he could punish you, not assign you rations, have you beat. So it was a very dictatorial, oppressive system, and this authority was necessary to force the peasants to go into this radical socialist transformation, because most of them, the vast majority, did not see it as a good deal. In terms of a development philosophy, one of the ideas that Mao had that he thought was very original was that rather than borrowing money, as most countries do, to invest in development, or borrowing technology and equipment from the Soviet Union, he was instead going to harness the power of the peasant that he owned already. In other words, he was going to send the peasants out to work day and night. He was going to send the peasants out to build irrigation work so they'd raise yields. And this wouldn't cost him anything. All it cost was essentially the party beating these people into enthusiasm so they would do this for a better China. Propaganda was a big part of this in breaking down the family unit in the village. They were creating the rituals of the party and the collective society, bugle blare, ceremonies celebrating Mao and the harvest, etc. Mao saw this as his great contribution. He didn't have anything. He didn't have to listen to Marx or to Khrushchev or Stalin. They didn't understand Asian society. They didn't understand peasants. Mao believed that he was a great socialist thinker, and the Great Leap Forward was going to prove that he was as great a thinker as Lenin and Marx. The problem is that his strategy for development was a colossal failure. It never could have worked. Why? Well, one of the things is he was taking the farmers out of the farming. Essentially, now party cadres were going to determine what activities the farmers were going to do. And they really got carried away with all these ideological schema. They were revolutionaries, right? And they were questioning the assumptions of the old society. They were questioning capitalist agriculture. They were going to create a better system. So one of their schemes is, we're going to dig a big pit. We're going to throw all our fertilizer in, and then we'll throw our seeds on, and we'll have wheat so thick that children can walk on it. Well, of course, this is absolute nonsense. When you over-fertilize, what you do is you kill the crops. If you put, the seeds too close together, they just starve each other out. So what actually happened with the cadres in charge of agriculture is yields plummeted very, very, very rapidly. But they had promised that because they were now socialist and free thinkers, the yields would go up 200, 300%. And they didn't want to admit failure. So when the state claimed 25% of the harvest, they didn't report what they actually produced. They reported what they promised they would produce, which meant that all the food that had been produced in the village was going to the state. The state sold it for hard capital to pay back the Soviet Union, and the people were left to starve. And this is how the Great Leap Forward became a humanitarian disaster, a mass starvation event that probably killed more people than all events of the 20th century, with the exception of World War II and the Spanish flu. Another cockamamie idea that Mao had is that the peasants could replace factories, and they could produce steel. If the peasants would just create furnaces, they would melt down iron, and they could produce as much steel as Britain. Well, they did produce a lot of pig iron, but it was practically worthless. So the big thing to understand about the Great Leap Forward is, not only did it not work, there was no hope of its working. It was a crazy experiment, and the Chinese peasant was left to pay. Now, it quickly became apparent to the Communist Party leaders, as their relatives were writing them, is that we've got no food, we're starving to death, you've got to do something. So in Lushan, they had a party conference where everyone got together, and Peng Duhai said, what's going on? This Great Leap Forward. My relatives are starving. We can't be taking all their grain. We got to reverse course. And Mao didn't take that too, easily. He took this personally. The situation in general is excellent. This is a direct quote. There are many problems, but the future is bright. And Peng Duhai is like, what are you talking about? They're starving to death. You got to think of the people. I mean, we're communists. We have to think about the proletariat. And what does Mao say? This is, I think, very telling about his personality, and where his narcissism and his socialist ideologies intersection. If you don't attack me, I will not attack you. And if you attack me, I for sure will attack you. And he did. Peng Duhai was, they had a dunce cap put on him. He had to confess his crimes. He was, humiliated. He was defrocked. He was put in prison. And this sent a very clear message to any other potential critics. If you criticize Mao, this is what's going to happen to you. And the result was the Communist Party lost its courage. They lost their tongue. And for 2 more disastrous seasons, the Great Leap Forward rolled on. More and more wheat produce from the countryside went to the cities. China paid back their loans. The people in the countryside were left to starve. Now, you will not, in any history book in China, find any mention to Mao's Great Famine. And this concept is the title of Frank Decoter's book, probably the most seminal study of the famine that resulted from the Great Leap Forward. Now, first of all, I have to say that when it comes to these natural disaster events, typically speaking, it's very difficult to come with an exact number in terms of the number of casualties. Now, Decoter's number is 45 million, and 45 million includes those who died from lack of calories and what he calls unnecessary deaths. And unnecessary deaths just means people that died in some way because they were malnourished. Now, most often when you die, you don't die from actual starvation. I mean, there's a certain point where you have so little nourishment that your organs basically shut down. But many people die before that. You might be weakened from disease. You could have a fall. Another thing is many people died of constipation because when you get so hungry, you put anything in your belly, right, to kind of stop the growling. So you can eat sticks and leaves, but you can't digest it, so you get backed up and you can die in that way as well. So I've seen various figures for the amount of people that die. The low end is 10 to 20 million. 45 million is at the high end. There's some numbers that are higher. The important thing to remember, though, is that there were tens of millions of people that died for sure, either directly or indirectly, relative to state policies. And the cadres who controlled the villages, had their hold on the people, kept the system moving forward to disastrous results. As the yields went down and down, people became hungrier, food became scarcer. Some people became fat, especially in the cities. A lot of the food from the countryside ended up there. Factory workers did okay. In the countryside, it was an absolute disaster. Critics of cadres, critics of Mao, 2 million tortured to death. This is Decoder going through the records. Probably the most incriminating aspect of this whole sorry affair is that many people were resorting to cannibalism to survive. So, what is cannibalism? Cannibalism, obviously, at a very basic level, this means that you eat human flesh. But let's put this kind of in a historical context. We know from the records of various authorities in China that cannibalism was frequently suspected or punished. So this was a thing that happened. How does this happen? Well, historically, it does happen in certain situations, and we need to understand this because we often say, "Oh, I'm hungry," and this means, supper's at 6 p.m. I got some growls. I'm going to take a candy bar and I'll wait for supper. Or we have in Canada people that don't get enough calories. They're malnourished. They only get one, square meal a day, for example, and that's hunger. But cannibalism is something different. This is what happens when essentially you don't eat anything for 20 days. And when that happens, you're in a way dehumanized. Because the only thing that your brain, your cells can think about is we need fuel to survive. So your mind becomes one track. I've got to get calories. It becomes a singular focus, and you will do anything to get those calories, and nothing else even registers. It's a survival instinct. So what is cannibalism? Well, it's essentially what when science fiction is a zombie. A zombie is an archetype for our historical memory of cannibalism, situations where humans became so hungry that it became, in a way, rational to eat your fellow humans. Now, when we're talking about cannibalism in the Great Leap Forward, from what I was able to figure out from Decoder's book, is that for the most part cannibalism was not a homicidal act. You weren't going around killing people and then baking up a meat pie and eating it. Generally, these were starving, desperate people that had no food. And what they would do, for example, is if their baby died and their neighbor's baby died, they would exchange babies so that they wouldn't have to eat their own child. That's how desperate you would come for food, but still have a shred of humanity. Or you might go to the burial yard, dig up an old corpse, and boil it to get a type of broth just to survive another day. So, in essence, cannibalism was an extreme response to an extreme situation. So this brings me to my tangent. When I grew up in the 1980s, it was a lot of vampire movies, Dracula. It was the me generation, a lot of fears about Wall Street and sucking people dry. And in the last 20 years, it's really been, zombie movies that have become very popular. And I think there's a reason for that. Something deep in our cultural consciousness is telling us that, we don't produce our own food. It comes from an industrial system that's threatened by drought, supply chain issues. We, in our own subconsciouses, are working out the danger of our civilization. And the zombie accomplice is our way of our subconscious working out some of these scenarios for a society where we don't produce our own food. So when 1962 arrived, probably 20 million Chinese had already died. Another 10 million were probably on the road to death. Finally, the Communist Party discovered their backbone. They forced Mao into self-criticism. Now, they didn't execute him. They didn't have a public trial. They didn't blame him for it. I mean, this was, Mao, the hero of the revolution. He had led, the Communist Party since the Great Leap Forward, or since the Long March. He had, orchestrated the socialist revolution. He was a hero. They didn't want to criticize him, but they wanted to put him to retirement and to get rid of these disastrous policies. So Deng Xiaoping and Liu essentially took over the charge, and they essentially returned back to where they were in 1956. They started to focus on building industries in the cities rather than building steel mills in the countryside. They focused on investing in industrial equipment. They got rid of a lot of the communes, and they allowed peasants to produce their own produce and sell the extra. So this, in a matter of months, really resolved all the problems that had been caused by the Great Leap Forward. The famine ended, the economy rebounded, and most party leaders were grateful. Whew, we dodged a bullet here. But there were some hardliners, socialists, utopians that had supported Mao that felt kind of a bitter sense in their mouth that somehow we're reverting back to capitalism, that we hadn't been able to achieve the socialist revolution. Now, these voices were probably pretty minor, and they couldn't say or criticize it too openly because the new leaders had solved the crisis and they put China on a good course again. So let's draw a few conclusions of the Great Leap Forward. Mao's Great Leap Forward was a radical strategy and theory for accelerated modernization based by trapping the latent enthusiasm of the Chinese peasants. So this marked, Mao's attempt to be a great theorist in the canon of socialist economics. It was also meant to free China from Soviet influence, the Soviet trade deal, and also the Soviet advisors and the price that this cost in terms of buying the Soviet equipment. China wanted to go its own way and free itself from the Soviet influence. When this strategy was resulting in mass starvation in the countryside, the party tried to reverse course, but Mao refused, and he silenced the critics, punished them. And this enabled the Great Leap Forward to roll on for really another 3 years. Only in 1962 did the party essentially force Mao into retirement, reverse course, and readopt a conventional mode of development. So the Great Leap Forward ended, but as we'll see, there's going to be a second Mao chapter where his dreams of a socialist makeover will be applied again relative to Chinese society.